mute and part of the conversation too. But welcome to Candid Career Convos by Kaiso Careers. We're really excited to be able to bring our third session now to you. My name is Shalima Cambridge, and I have my co-host here, Shelly Vidal. If you want to say hello.
Hi, everyone.
We have some great guests here who are friends and guests who can really give some great insight. Avita Sharma and Dr. Joy Walcott-Francis. So thanks so much for joining us. As we get settled, I want to make sure that you know we're here in a safe place. We're centering our voices, our Black, Indigenous, and people of color voices in this conversation around career advancement. And with that in mind, I want to acknowledge where we're located, where we're calling in from. So for Shelly and I, we are both located on the ancestral land of the Coast Salish peoples, specifically the Kwantlen, Katsi, Semiahmoo, and Tsawwassen First Nations, who continue to care for and sustain the land that we have the privilege of learning, playing, raising families, engaging with friends, and understanding who we are in this place on. So welcome to where you are located. And if you don't know yet, you can always take a moment to reflect on where you are and what that means for your story in our country. So welcome. A little bit about us. Shelly, how about you jump in and share?
Sure. So I'll start off with sharing the name Kaiso Careers and where it comes from and why we selected the name. So the name Kaiso is indigenous to Trinidad and Tobago, which is also where Shalima and my parents are originally from. Shalima and I are both born, we're both born in Canada, but our parents are from Trinidad and Tobago. And the whole name Kaiso, it actually comes from the music, which is a fusion of African, Latin, Indian, just chutney, all types of that beautiful music coming together in the island of Trinidad. And so back in the 19th century, this music was established, and it was also used as a way to communicate for enslaved people, to communicate where the slave masters didn't actually know what was happening. And so it was kind of a bit of a hidden message for people to tell their stories and connect and build community all through this type of music, Kaiso. So that's a little bit about the background of the music. I'd like to share a little bit about who I am, and then Shalima will share a little bit about who she is. So as I mentioned, my name is Shelly Ann Vidal, and I was born and raised in Canada, in the West Coast here. And my parents, as I mentioned, are originally from Trinidad. So I've straddled the fence of being Canadian and Trini, like many people. I work full-time as an instructor at Langara College. When I'm not working as an instructor in the Career Services Department, I'm also doing work in anti-racism work at Langara College. Outside of that, I volunteer in various different organizations. The main one that I volunteer with is the National Congress of Black Women Foundation. I'm also a part of BC Black Educators Network and the Federation of Black Canadians. That's just a quick little overview of who I am. Shalima, take it over.
Sure. So yes, my name is Shalima Cambridge. Primarily, I work in leadership development at Fraser Health Authority here in Surrey. But also included with that, I also work in diversity, equity, and inclusion training, facilitating audits for organizations with a consultancy called HRX. And so for me, being able to bring these two things together through Kaiso Careers is really important. Understanding how people develop their own sense of leadership, their own sense of career movement and what they want to see for themselves, as well as creating a space and environment in which people from many diverse communities can thrive. So that's a little bit about me. You can read more on LinkedIn. You're welcome to connect with all of us on LinkedIn if you like. But I want to share a bit about our guests because we're really excited to have these two with us. So we have Dr. Joy Walcott-Francis. She's a feminist, so we have a little bit about you, but we'll get you to share a bit more in a moment. A feminist scholar, educator, and researcher who's primarily focused on post-colonial and anti-racism work, and in particular on the ways in which Black folks are impacted by systems of health inequity. Joy is also on the board of the African Women's Health Services Society of BC. And we also have Avita Sharma, who's an educator, a doctoral student, community volunteer, and mother who's prioritizing the development and delivery of culturally competent care and treatment of diverse and marginalized populations. Avita is also Vice President of the Trinidad and Tobago Cultural Society of BC, whom I've had the pleasure to volunteer with in the past. And so welcome to you both. Our opening question to you to get us all situated is related to careers. So one of the questions we always get as youngsters from the time we're 3, 4, 5 is, what do you want to be when you grow up? And so a variation of that we really enjoy is, what problem do you want to solve in the world when you grow up? So we pose that to you to tell us a bit about who you are. What problem are you solving in the world in the work that you do right now? So how about we start with Joy? What problem are you solving in the world in the work that you do right now?
All right, thanks. Thanks, Shalima. And thanks, Shelly, Avita. I'm just so delighted to see everyone, and welcome everyone who is participating with us here today. So in terms of, career-wise, you know, Shalima, you talk about from where growing up and you're being asked, what do you want to be? I can remember growing up, one of my aspirations was to become a lawyer. And I, you know, that for me was, I just really wanted to be a lawyer. But I guess it didn't pan out that way. And so I ended up doing a number of things, from going to teachers college to doing a bachelor's. And I think it was along that lines when doing my bachelor's. One thing that, you know, stood out for me was because my bachelor's degree was in international relations and social psychology. But during that, I remember doing a course in gender studies. And that was a thing for me. It was at that moment when I was almost at the end of, this was my final year at the end of the degree, I realized that I didn't really want to do international relations. My problem that I wanted to solve had to do with women and women's rights, you know, gender rights. And so for me, it took me along that pathway. And so where I'm at now is along those same lines, but I've also gotten to the point where I'm spreading my wings, you know, recognizing that gender, it's much more than gender equity. There are so many intersections within that. So now I'm in general thinking about equity, and you mentioned, you know, diversity and equity. So where I'm at right now, I'm really focused on thinking about how it is that persons who go by various and even different identities from binary identities that we're accustomed to, how these individuals are included in systems and are meant to feel a part of those systems. So I think when I think about the problem that I want to solve, it really has to do with equity, and in particular, my experience of coming here, moving here to Canada, has made me even more focused on issues of race. So race, equity, gender. So those are the issues that I'm really focused now on engaging with and attempting to solve. Yeah.
Thanks, Joy. And Avita, how about you?
Yeah, thanks, Joy, and thanks, Shalima and Shelly, for having us, and welcome everyone. So there's definitely some similarities with what Joy spoke about, but for me, particularly with in terms of career development and that trajectory, if I go way back, the emphasis on education was drilled very hard into my upbringing, like many of us who are children of immigrants, particularly immigrants from the Caribbean. There was no question that your career path was going to be forged through a dedication to educational development and academia. So here we are, years later. Early on, I knew that I wanted to work in a helping capacity. And at that time, not to age myself, but you know, it was what kind of doctor, what kind of medical path could you follow to work in that helping capacity? And then that evolved into the social sciences, and my interest really flourished in psychology and mental health. I had an interest in forensic psychology and psychiatry at one point in time. And I was really trying hard to get into that line of work, to work with criminals and individuals who are deemed as not mentally fit to stand trial. And I ran into many roadblocks, which diverted me to where I am today. And I realized that the universe had rightful plans in place, because I don't think I would have been a good fit for that line of work. So I do work in a helping capacity now. I did my education in psychology, so undergraduate and multiple graduate pursuits in psychology and mental health. But my area of specialty now is working with individuals with disabilities of any kind. Anyone who's suffered some kind of personal injury or has been displaced from work or function or activity due to injury, illness, or disability. And I work in a helping capacity with reintegration, getting back to life, getting back to work. So I feel like I checked off that box in terms of ending up working in a helping capacity, but not necessarily the route that I had thought several decades ago. What specifically my work entails assisting with career redirection. So clients I work with typically, as I said, have been displaced from career through no choice of their own. And there's a lot of those psycho-emotional contextual factors that come into play in terms of loss of identity, loss of finances, loss of social structure, and so forth. So a lot of the work in terms of career exploration in conjunction with rehabilitation, so related to their health status, it opens up the discussion in terms of some of the things I think we're going to talk about today. I look at intersectionality and a generational approach to discussing person's career development and what they want to achieve, how they can reclaim control over their life and their future career after so much has been lost and taken away. So I think we'll talk a little bit more about that later, but the question was, I know I've kind of taken the long route, what am I doing to make a difference in the world? And I think that is amplifying the voice of these marginalized people that I have the privilege to work with.
Beautiful. Thank you so much, Avita. You and Joy made some great points, and I think definitely what you mentioned, we will be diving deeper into some of those points on career and your passion and finding that, as well as making sure that your journey is in alignment with your values. We'll be covering that. But before we do that, one of the questions I have for you both stems on one point that you made, which is the fact that for many immigrants, they instill the importance of education to their children. when they come to this country. I know for myself, it was the case, and Shalima as well. Our parents drilled that into our heads. Education is key, education is power. And it can open up opportunities for many of us. So one of the questions that we have is, how did you decide, or what led you both to that decision to take that journey or that path on pursuing your PhD, and then for Joy completing it? Because I know, Avita, you're still in it, but you're it's an exciting journey. So what led you to that journey, and did you always know that you were going to get it, or work towards earning it? I shouldn't say get it, it's work. So what led you to that? Did you always know, or was it something that you were like, oh, okay, yeah, I think I need to do this?
Joy, do you want to answer that first, or should I?
I can go. Shelley, it's just, I don't know. So yes, you're right in that for a number of us, I mean, I came here as first-gen immigrant. So, so I think the focus and the impetus really on education has been instilled in us through our Caribbean parents, because that was one thing that my mom made sure of. For her, it was, if you don't have an education, then you won't be successful in life. So education was really big for her, and she instilled that in me and all of my siblings. And so I really understood and knew the importance of education. And so even through prep school, primary school, then, from primary school, this whole thing, the support was there for me to do and pass my common entrance exams, parents investing in me to make sure that I had the extra lessons, and I stayed back from, stayed at school after hours to study and to get all of those extra lessons. So it's all of those things. And then after to high school, and it was the same thing. But then in high school, I started having the sense that had I not or completed high school with a certain amount of subjects at the time, then it would have been downhill, because by no means was I growing up in a family that was wealthy. So I knew that it would have been a struggle. And so if I wanted to be out of that situation, or, out of poverty, so to speak, then I had to excel in high school. I had to figure out where to get myself to next. And so for me, from high school, it was a decision that I also had to make. Am I going to try to go to college or university, or am I going to invest in a career? And so the best decision there was to invest in a career. And at that time, I saw teaching as being that career. And so off I went to Teachers College. That came with its challenges. And I will admit, I did 2 years of Teachers College, and the final year I was requested to repeat 2 courses before moving to final year. One of those courses was math, because that's not my strong point. So, but then what happened was that that time when I was required to sit out and do those courses, I decided to start a university program. And so I started on a certificate course, and I started working, and then I got into working, and wow, I was now earning an income. And so that was the path for me, and that led to my undergrad degree. At the end of my undergrad degree, I realized that I had to get a master's, because it seemed to me as though everybody around me was getting had a university degree. And so for me to be competitive, it was getting that master's degree. And so a friend of myself and another friend, we decided, we combed through universities, and based on the program that we wanted to do, we headed off to England. And so we did a year and a half in England doing our master's degree. Went back home to Jamaica. Some of you, I'm from Jamaica. Went back home to Jamaica, started working again, but also started working in an administrative capacity, as well as now teaching. And that is also a passion of mine. But with the teaching came that feeling of, there needs to be something else. You know, and looking around me at the time at the university, because I was also working at the university, looking around at the time, I was seeing the professors, the persons who were in teaching academic positions as being professors and having more publishing and doing those kinds of things. And I was blessed with having a boss who was he was the person who made me want to do this. So when I think about wanting to pursue a PhD, I think about my boss at the time, who I just wanted to be like this person. And so that led me into applying and pushing and wanting to do this thing. So, so that took me to my journey here to pursue this program. No. So that didn't come until, I guess, a few years before I came here. So I wasn't always driven to have a PhD. I just felt as though I was going along with the process, going along with what was needed at the time, and even with what was expected somehow. My mom didn't say to me, because my mom isn't someone who understands this whole process of post-secondary education, but I knew that she expected big things of me. And how can I make her proud? How can I have my siblings want to follow in my footsteps? That came out of my feeling that more was expected of me. So that's when I really launched into wanting to do a PhD. It wasn't something that was forethought. So yeah. And then that came with those other additional struggles of finally finishing and getting through to a PhD. So, but I'm sure we'll talk more about that. Right, Shelley?
We're going to talk about a lot of stuff. Thank you, Joy. Yeah, it is, some of us have a clear shot and some of us have a very windy road in this journey of academia. And I think one of the things you said, which is really important, is you had that boss who was like a mentor, who really showed you the opportunity that is out there. And that was back in Jamaica, right? Yeah, so I think that's also, it's key. If you don't have a family member who's going to say, yeah, PhD is your route, and then it's important to have people in your circle who can encourage that along. Thank you. Avita, how about you?
Excuse me. Yeah, well, as I mentioned before, and like you all attested to, education was drilled in from an early age. So I had my sights set on doing a doctoral degree at some point. That was always sort of in my foresight. After I completed undergraduate studies, I started working. I started working in the field, and I was exposed to being a clinician in the world of health and rehabilitation, which, as I'd mentioned earlier, was not my plan. So there was so much to learn, and there was so much knowledge gathering and learning that was happening on site. So then I felt, well, now is a good time for me to do a master's degree. And the master's at that time that I did was in clinical counseling psychology, and very much aligned with the work that I was doing. So I would say that the circumstances that led me to that place of employment sort of directed how I tweaked my pursuit of graduate studies. Again, I had in my mind that I would do a doctorate at some point for personal satisfaction, but also because I knew, as you said, Joy, we want to make our parents proud. And I'm going to come back to that in a few minutes. So graduate school happened, I got a master's degree, and then I got married. And then life took me on a different path. Then I had children. I have 2 girls, as some of you know, and my practice, my professional practice, fortunately became very, very busy. And that's where my focus was. My energy was on working, developing my career, doing great work, trying to do great work for my clients, and being a wife and mother and family member, etc. Again, I'd never forgotten about the back of my mind, the goal to pursue doctoral studies. And over the years, I continuously looked at different programs, doctoral programs. It's not easy to get into, right, Joy? You know this, right? So you kind of have this, you sort of are stuck, for me at least, towing the line of, well, it's something that I want, but things are going pretty well career-wise now. Do I want to subject myself to potential rejection? Because we had to go through that to get into graduate studies, to get into the master's program. Also, do I want to take on this huge new area of work and commitment and stress? And is that something that I can fit into now? So anyways, life continued on, and my girls are growing up. My work is busy. I'm feeling generally quite satisfied in my career. And you know, we're not in careers to volunteer. So financially, I was feeling like this is good. You know, I'm not going to be greedy. I'm not going to chase the dollar. I'm happy where things are. And then I suffered a loss. And that made me stop in my tracks. So some of you know, I lost my dad, who was my BFF, over 2 years ago. And that came as a shock to me. And that forced me to stop and really think about myself, my life, and just how I've actually been on autopilot, right? And grief does strange things to you. I'll talk about the positive of what it's done for me. It forced me to really stop. And one night I was deep in the, I guess, you know, in the depths of grief. And I thought to myself, what am I waiting on? What would my dad say to me, right? One of my biggest fans, my biggest encouragers, what would he say to me? And what would he be thinking? You know, he would say, Avi, you'll never know unless you try. And then I started to think of myself as a product of my parents. So I went back to, you know, what did my parents come to this country for? What would they want for me? And I started to think about their journey and how they took that leap of faith, like you did, Joy, right? I'm a product of immigrants. I didn't have to go through that very scary, challenging, courageous leap to immigrate to a new country. And so I started to think about myself as my father's daughter. And with that, that prompted me very last minute to submit my application to a doctoral program that I'd been looking at for a little while, not thinking that I would get in. And I said, I'm just going to do this. Whatever happens, I know that, okay, at least I've tried. This is the conversation I would have sort of existentially with my dad. And I forgot about it. I forgot about the application. I submitted it and just, and then COVID hit. COVID started and everybody's world and focus shifted on pandemic life. And a few weeks into March, I got this acceptance letter. And I said to myself, well, I wasn't expecting this. What do I do with this now? And my husband, also a big fan, a big encourager for me, said, well, you can't turn this down now. You can't not do this. This is, you know, you elevated yourself and you had the courage to step forward and really think about it. And he said, what would your parents What would your parents say? And so I've been thinking about that from a generational perspective, right? How did I get to where I am, right? Whose backs did I have to step on, and whose backs had to break for me to get here? And thinking about my parents' journey. And then the other piece of that generational context is, what do I then want for the next generation, for my daughters? What do I want them to see from me and to be inspired from that? So that's how I've ended up where I am today in this doctoral program. It's great. Of course, I started it, I accepted the acceptance. And it is a lot of work, but now I recognize that it isn't just about me and my goals and what I wanted to be when I grew up, but what sort of the generation before me had hoped for me, and what the generation after me is being inspired by.
Avita, that resonates so much with me in terms of, knowing where I come from, who I come from, the expectations that come with that, as well as what I want to pass on to my children. So that I have a daughter and a son, and I can say having my daughter for me was such a motivator for me to do certain things, make different changes, so that I can make sure I instill in her that same motivation, that same thought that was instilled in me as a young child too. One of the themes that's come up in both of your journeys is kind of this, taking in from the world what is there and using that as your push forward, as, okay, I'm taking in information from around me and using that as your decisioning, how you make decisions as to where you go. Shelley talked about the importance of mentorship as well. And one of the things that I know I and perhaps many others have experienced both in work and perhaps in academia as well, as being the one of only or the only. So seeing some smiles, I'm thinking that is a common experience or something you might be able to relate to. And I'm curious about this idea of, finding the people that can mentor you, that can understand your specific experience and understand how much culture and, who we are as people plays a role in our motivations and what we're doing and why we're studying things and why we may push ourselves so much. And sometimes can be so hard on ourselves because of that too. So yeah, I'd love to hear a bit about your experience in your academic journey around being the one of only or the only, and what that meant to you. Where did you reach out to find mentors that can support you in your specific journey from our BIPOC lens?
All right, yeah. Avita is okay, I go. Shalima, that is, oh my goodness, in my journey here throughout, I guess throughout academia and this postgrad work, it's been one of the most challenging times for me. Because I think first, well, the unknowing was one piece that I had to grapple with. That thing we talk about as culture shock. Culture shock can be so many different things to us, but that was, for me, that was a part of my culture shock. Coming in and being in a program, being in a department in which I was the only Black skin. Who would I share conversations with? Who would I share free time with? Who would understand some of the struggles that I was having? And it's weird. I often think about this, that for some reason, the two persons who came together in my program was me and another woman of Southeast Asian descent. So oftentimes when we had a break in between classes, she'd be the one calling me, "Hey Joy, come, let's go eat." It sounded as though it was an order from her. "Let's go eat now." But she was the person that we seemed to gravitate towards each other, because we were the only two BIPOC persons in this course, in this program. But on our own, we were also just one of. And so it was right throughout my program, it was a huge struggle for me. And even now, I think it continues to be a huge problem in academia. How do we find mentors and have BIPOC students, in particular Black students, find mentors who are able to guide them, who are able to share in conversations. And without that, I'm just thinking part of the, I guess, maybe trauma for me as well was constantly having this feeling of being an imposter within the program, within everything that I was learning. It came with that feeling of not being adequate. Joy, why are you here? This is no place for you. And right throughout the entire journey and even afterwards, these were questions that kept coming back to me, feelings of being an imposter. Now, it was important for me as well. So some of the persons that I encountered, in that journey weren't even persons who were in my same program, but persons, other Black scholars, Black faculty that I happened to come across. Because the Black population at the time was so small that when you see one Black person, you're like, oh yeah, that person is from here, or that person is from this program. So we had an opportunity to come across each other or to know each other. And those were the bonds that were formed for me. I remember one day I went into the library and someone came up to me, another Black person. She came up to me and said to me, "Oh, you're the girl from Jamaica." And I was thinking, okay, yeah, and who are you? And she was another woman from the Caribbean, from Barbados. And when we got into how she knew it was me, she heard that there's another Black person on campus in a PhD program, and the person has locks. It could only be me. And so it was these kinds of challenges. But even just outside of mentorship, one of the things that really kept me through that program was finding a Black students community. That was the thing that kept me going. That was the thing that made me feel accepted, because just feeling as though you're accepted on campus is a huge thing. A campus that you don't see many persons like yourself. And so when I happened upon this group, the group, it grew and in size and in diversity and everything. But it was having this safe space, having like-minded persons with whom I can, we can share things, some of our concerns, our grievances, sharing our joys and laughters and the stories, and encourage each other, because that was big for us, trying to encourage each other as minority persons on campus. So for me, it wasn't so much the academic mentorship, because for me, it was lacking, and still there are challenges with that. But finding a community of students who were able to identify, with whom I was able to identify, and for us to share those kinds of things. That's what really kept me through that program.
Thanks, Joy. And Avita, if you can share a bit about your experience too.
So I'll talk a little bit, sort of a different perspective about my journey, I guess, through academia and through the world of work. And I used the term, and Joy used the term earlier about intersecting and intersectionality. And this is something that is very important. I spent a lot of time thinking about that now. And what that's been born out of for me is my experience growing up and doing my schooling here in Vancouver, where racially, I looked like people who I did not share ethnic or cultural similarities with. I had a lot of difficulty growing up in the school system here with that, because I felt like I didn't fit in, right? So culturally and ethnically, I connected stronger with people who did not look like me. So you kind of, again, towing the line of where do I fit in? And, you know, in high school, it's the worst time to go through any kind of, to be socially different. So towing the line, going through a lot of identity development. I see some names on here in our group, and there's two people in our audience today that I know can attest to what I'm speaking of. One person, I've known them for most of my life. And one person probably went through something very similarly, where racially we didn't match with who we were expected to be culturally. And that created problems. And the other person on here, we connected on so many different wavelengths of our intersections that it actually didn't matter. And so that person gave me a sense of belonging. That's what we all want, is belonging. So fast forward now to the mentorship piece, both in my clinical professional practice as well as through academia. My mentors were always based on the area of study or the area of professional development. And I didn't seek out mentors that aligned with me from a cultural or racial or ethnic standpoint. I felt that I got that type of fulfillment outside of academia, outside of my professional practice. Hence our involvement, Shelley and Shalima, in the Trinidad and Tobago Cultural Society, right? Then I align myself with women such as yourself and our parents and everybody that we were interacting with to get that fulfillment and that mentorship, if you will, from a cultural perspective. Now that I've gotten older and wiser, and now that I'm in this doctoral program, I have a real focus more on not presenting myself as a siloed individual. So I am not a brown-skinned woman only and leave it to you to make assumptions about what my brownness means, okay? So I present myself and I use the terms ethno-racial cultural perspective because that is an intersectional perspective of who I am, right? My skin is connected to my culture, it's connected to my ethnicity. And I present myself from that standpoint, right? So I am a Canadian-born woman. Oh, the gender is part of it as well. I'm a Canadian-born woman with heritage from the Caribbean, specifically Trinidad and Tobago, with the bulk of my racial background is from an Indian perspective, or excuse me, from Indian ancestry, right? So that's a lot of words, but that actually there's some pride and there's courage with giving that explanation as to who I am, to understand who I am. So again, I'm forgetting the original question. Mentorship. So I'm using that perspective and that courageous sort of explanation to want to be a mentor to others who fall within that sort of intersectional context as I do moving forward. Because I'm going to admit something. When I felt like the scared little brown girl who was scared to use her voice, you know, in a professional standpoint, I used to say to myself, let's call him John. What would John do? John was or is a very well-respected, lovely, white, older male who I've worked with and who was a mentor for me from a clinical professional standpoint, but seemed to have all of the courage in the world and was never scared to use his voice. And when I felt scared, I used to say to myself, how would John handle this? I need to channel my inner John. And it's not until recently that I said to myself, why am I channeling an older white male? I had an aha moment, right? But this completely exemplifies that muting that we do to ourselves because we feel that we are lesser than. So my goal in terms of mentorship is to bravely put forth myself as an intersectional woman, and so that other people who are coming up in the same career path as myself that are looking for mentors, that I can help them to amplify their voices from a non-siloed perspective.
Thank you so much, Avita, for sharing that. And I think I know I could see Shelley's head nodding, mine, because you share so much of, you know, what it's like straddling different worlds, right? Whether your parents are from somewhere else and you are raised Canadian and you may not look like what is seen as typical Canadian, you end up straddling different worlds. Or if you've moved here and now you're bringing your own culture to this space and understanding what that means in this context, like there are so many different worlds we straddle. And when you can identify and share what those different worlds are, there's more people that can see you and then place themselves in that position as well. So it's like changing from what would John do to what would Avita do? What would Joy do? And have that image in our heads and in the heads of youngsters as well. So we can see those role models for ourselves. And it really ties into, Joy, what you talked about in that imposter syndrome as well. And, you know, when we don't see ourselves, it's so hard to actually realize that, yes, we are supposed to be there. One of the pieces that I wanted to pick on, and we're short on time, but we'll get to our signature question in a moment. But before we get there, I wanted to touch on this piece of this idea of identity and how that relates to our work world as well. So I know, Avita, you're doing work in this area right now and understanding, you know, how people understand their identity when it comes like being forced to make work transitions. And this might also tie into our cultural identity and how we see ourselves within roles in different work environments. So I'm curious what you're finding in that space, Avita, and then perhaps, Joy, what your thoughts are on what Avita is studying right now.
Mm-hmm. So I really appreciate one of the words you and Shelley used to promote today's event is storytelling. And that's one thing that I know is quite prevalent in certain cultures to understand identity in a person's experience. And I've really started to place more emphasis on getting people's story in a clinical practice. So from a healthcare perspective, we typically operate from a Western medical perspective, a Western health perspective. And that doesn't lend well from individuals who come from, say, collectivist cultures, right? And then are forced to fit into a, you know, a square peg into a round hole within an individualistic type of culture that we have here in North America. So what I've done, and I try to make little changes within my own practice with these individuals who are trying to find their identity again, is I give them a platform to tell their story. My interview questions, my clinical interview questions during my evaluations or my treatment sessions really are open-ended. Tell me about, right? Because I'm not there, and I don't want them to feel that they're just at another medical appointment and that I have a clipboard in front of me and I'm check marking boxes and I'm looking at the time, because it is important for me to understand where they've come from, what their story is about how they got here, what their responsibilities are. So a lot of the clients I see, as I mentioned, have been displaced from work and have suffered financial consequences. What is their financial responsibility? We have people that live in multi-generational households and are the sole income provider for a very large family. That can create a whole different set of psycho-emotional stressors. So I try to get what their story is about, where they've come from, how they came here. You know, an immigrant's journey is very different to a refugee's journey or somebody who came here for studies. So that what their story is about their life here in Canada, what work meant to them. There are social and emotional benefits that come from work, and what that meant. What identity did their work and their career give to them? And how did they end up in that work? Did they just land the job like many people did? Are they underemployed because they were a professional in their home country and now have to do a semi-skilled entry-level job because their credentials were not recognized? So I could go on and on about examples. The point is, I'm trying to get their story from beginning to where they are today in order to understand how best to assist them with identity development and transitioning.
Yeah, I think, you know, that storytelling piece is so key, especially if we are going through transitions or deciding to change to go into more schooling or change careers, because we may have a mindset for one story, but can we be flexible to change that story for ourselves, add in more pieces, see ourselves as a different character than we may have forethought in that story as well. You know, one of the things you mentioned, Avita, was like, you know, people coming here and then not being able to have their professional status actually recognized. And I can imagine that's a huge blow to how someone views themselves. And I can imagine it also has some health implications as well, as to just how do we deal with not being able to be who we want to be or who we see ourselves at. And Joy, I know you've done a lot of research on health within immigrant communities, Black communities. I'm curious if you have any thoughts around the impact of, you know, career transition, the stress that may come up with that, and our ability to take care of ourselves and our health needs.
Yeah, that's you know, Shalima, it's a big part of the challenge and the stressors that our communities face. So case in point, I'm just thinking this through, and it's making me remember. So I'm not sure whether you remember some time ago, I think this was 2011, and some of the persons here in this group may remember. In 2011, there was Gatineau in Quebec. There was a publication, something around introducing and welcoming immigrant communities to Gatineau. And it came out as a list of things to be, welcome to Gatineau, but things to be mindful of and wary of. And this was a guide to new immigrants to Gatineau. And one of the things I remember feeling so angry about this, because one of the things held within that guide to immigrants coming to Canada and to that area, it was around being conscious of cooking smelly foods. I mean, I'm just saying this out of, it's not exactly the statement. I can't remember exactly the statement, but it was something around being mindful or refraining from cooking smelly foods. This was 2011. And it was an issue that several persons, immigrant communities, several persons in the community brought up and was challenging the city about. Now imagine that you are coming to the country as an immigrant, whatever your status is, refugee, whatever it is, you're coming to the country, you're already experiencing the stressors and the trauma associated with coming, the trauma associated with settling, feeling included, surviving, living, getting a job, all of those things. And now for the city to publish something to say, oh, we don't want your smelly food around here, put the lid on it. That in itself is trauma. That is adding to the stressors of being an outsider, because just by being called an immigrant or referred to as an immigrant, you're seen as an outsider. That's something that impacts and has the potential to impact mental health of persons of color. And so when I think about that, I am just thinking about being that person who is so wanting to feel included, but at the same time, I'm working a job or going to school, but I'm afraid of bringing my food, my lunch with me to school or work because I will offend others. What am I left to do? It's either I'm going to go hungry or I'm going to bring this food with me and feel excluded or feel substandard. So that in itself, one part of trauma, but then also thinking about whether or not there are systems here to be able to deal with that trauma. So there may be, whether it's not policies themselves that are outright to say, well, we don't support and provide services, mental health services for persons such as you. But it could be that the barrier that's there is that, well, I'm really not equipped to deal with your kind of trauma. So that adds to it, and then there's the other piece that where I'm coming from, culturally, I am not taught or encouraged to talk about my feelings. I'm not encouraged or taught to talk about mental health and stress. Especially me being in my Black skin, I'm supposed to be a strong Black woman. So all of these kinds of things, trying to fit in, trying to feel included as a BIPOC person, as a Black woman, as a woman of color, these are some of the things that do add to our mental well-being. How do we deal with it? How do we support that? For me, part of that goes back to even some of what you're talking about, your communities. So a lot of us, because for me, my coping skills lie in my ability to connect with my community. Being able to be on and participate on some of these boards, that's what allows me to feel a part of the community. But I think the larger challenge here is us being able to have that system or systems in place that allows us to better cope with some of the challenges, mental health, emotional challenges that we experience on a day-to-day basis.
Thank you so much, Joy and Avita. Wow, I wish we had another hour. This is such a rich and full conversation. And again, this is part of why Shalima and I are doing this work, because we need to have these conversations so that we can grow and we can have that community with one another. Joy, both you and Avita talked about the need to find communities and be within communities so that we can cope with their challenges and not feel so isolated and alone. So thank you both so much. Before we go, we have our signature question that we're going to ask you. And of course, going back to our lovely Caribbean roots, the question is, are you feeling like you are more of a fast wine, slow wine, red wine, or white wine? Jump in, Joy or Avita, either one.
All of the above, depending on the season, depending on who I'm with, who I'm around, whose voice I'm trying to amplify, who I'm trying to educate, which I think we could do a part 2 about that because of sensationalism that's happening in the media, educating others. We won't get started on that because that will be another few hours. Anyways, I'm all of the above, but I like being of Trini heritage. I like the idea of thinking that I'm a fast wine kind of girl.
Nice.
Really just because I'm a diehard Machel fan.
Yes.
Awesome. Joy?
Yeah, I think I'll go with Avita as well, dependent on the situation. I can call upon any of those. A lot of times, so yes, I'm from Jamaica. I love me some reggae music. I hardcore reggae, you know, dancehall, that's me. But I'm also a soca-holic, having taught soca size classes. So, you know, fast wine, soca, Machel, of course, Avita. So yeah, I mean, I think for me, I just love Caribbean music, Caribbean heritage. Shelley, when we started, you were playing Alice Nine's Roll It Girl, and I was trying to think about some other things that was going on here on the side of my desk, and I could not focus because all that's going in my head is Roll It Girl, and I'm fast whining, right? So, but again, dependent on the situation and what it calls for.
Awesome. Thank you so much. We love our signature questions.
So we have some more music to end it off with. We also want to make sure that you know how to find us. We're on Facebook, Instagram, LinkedIn. You can also find us on YouTube. So we are going to be posting our session. And we thank you all for, I see your eyes lighting up, Joy, with this one. Thank you all for, coming here, attending, creating the space. And thank you so much, Avita and Joy, for sharing your stories with us.
For having us, and thanks everyone for joining.
Yeah. Thank you,
Bye, everyone.
Bye, everyone. Thanks again.
Thank you.